everyone. Welcome back to Rabbi's Reflection. We'll look at a story from Kitchen Table Wisdom called The Container. Enjoy. The Container. Often anger is a sign of engagement with life. People who are angry are touched deeply by the events of their lives and feel strongly about them. As an emotion, it has its limitations and certainly has very bad press, but my experience with ill people suggests that there is something healthy about it. Certainly, the cancer studies by Levy, Timoshak, and Greer suggest that many people who recover become angry first. Anger is just a demand for change, a passionate wish for things to be different. It can be a way to reestablish important boundaries and assert personal integrity in the face of a body and life-altering disease. And as it was for me, it may be the first expression of the will to live. Anger becomes a problem for people only when they become wedded to it as a way of life. One of the angriest people I have ever worked with was a young man with osteogenic sarcoma of the right leg. He had been a high school and college athlete, and until the time of his diagnosis, his life had been good. Beautiful women, fast cars, personal recognition. 2 weeks after his diagnosis, they had removed his right leg above the knee. This surgery, which saved his life, also ended his life. Playing ball was a thing of the past. These days, there are many sorts of self-destructive behaviors open to an angry young man like this. He refused to return to school. He began to drink heavily, to use drugs, to alienate his former admirers and friends, and to have one automobile accident after the other. After the second of these, his former coach called and referred him to me. He was a powerfully built and handsome young man, profoundly self-oriented and isolated. At the beginning, he had the sort of rage that felt very familiar to me. Filled with a sense of injustice and self-pity, he hated all the well people. In our second meeting, hoping to encourage him to show his feelings about himself, I gave him a drawing pad and asked him to draw a picture of his body. He drew a crude sketch of a vase, just an outline. Running through the center of it, he drew a deep crack. He went over and over the crack with a black crayon, gritting his teeth and ripping the paper. He had tears in his eyes. They were tears of rage. It seemed to me that the drawing was a powerful statement of his pain and the finality of his loss. It was clear that this broken vase could never hold water, could never function as a vase again. It hurt to watch. After he left, I folded the picture up and saved it. It seemed too important to throw away. In time, his anger began to change in subtle ways. He began one session by handing me an item torn from our local newspaper. It was an article about a motorcycle accident in which a young man had lost his leg. His doctors were quoted at length. I finished reading and looked up. "These idiots don't know the first thing about it," he said furiously. Over the next month, he brought in more of these articles, some from the paper and some from magazines. A girl who had been severely burned in a house fire, a boy whose hand had been partly destroyed in the explosion of his chemistry set. His reactions were always the same, a harsh judgment of the well-meaning efforts of doctors and parents. His anger about these other young people began to occupy more and more of our session time. No one understood them. No one was there for them. No one really knew how to help them. He was still enraged, but it seemed to me that underneath this anger, a concern for others was growing. Encouraged, I asked him if he wanted to do anything about it. Caught by surprise, at first he said no, but just before he left, he asked me if I thought he could meet some of these others who suffered injuries like his. People came to our teaching hospital from all over the world, and the chances were good that there were some with the sorts of injuries that mattered to him. I said that I had thought it was quite possible and I would look into it. It turned out to be easy. Within a few weeks, he had begun to visit young people on the surgical wards whose problems were similar to his own. He came back from these visits full of stories, delighted to find that he could reach young people. He was often able to be of help when no one else could. After a while, he felt able to speak to parents and families, helping them to better understand and to know what was needed. The surgeons, delighted with the results of these visits, referred more and more people to him. Some of these doctors had seen him play ball, and they began to spend a little time with him. As he got to know them, his respect for them grew. Gradually, his anger faded, and he developed a sort of ministry. I just watched and listened and appreciated. My favorite of all his stories concerned a visit to a young woman who had a tragic family history. Breast cancer had claimed the lives of her mother, her sister, and her cousin. Another sister was in chemotherapy. This last event had driven her into action. At 21, she took one of the only options open at that time. She had both her breasts removed surgically. He visited her on a hot midsummer day, wearing shorts, his artificial leg in full view. Deeply depressed, she lay in bed with her eyes closed, refusing to look at him. He tried everything he knew to reach her, but without success. He said things to her that only another person with an altered body would dare to say. He made jokes. He even got angry. She did not respond. All the while, a radio was softly playing rock music. Frustrated, he finally stood, and in a last effort to get her attention, he unstrapped the harness of his artificial leg and let it drop to the floor with a loud thump. Startled, she opened her eyes and saw him for the first time. Encouraged, he began to hop around the room, snapping his fingers in time to the music and laughing out loud. After a moment, she burst out laughing too. "Fella," she said, "if you can dance, maybe I can sing." This young woman became his friend and began to visit people in the hospital with him. She was in school, and she encouraged him to return to school, to study psychology and dream of carrying his work further. Eventually, she became his wife. A very different sort of person from the models and cheerleaders he had dated in the past. But long before this, we ended our sessions together. In our final meeting, we were reviewing the way he had come, the sticking points and the turning points. I opened his chart and found the picture of the broken vase that he had drawn 2 years before. Unfolding it, I asked him if he remembered the drawing he had made of his body. He took it in his hands and looked at it for some time. "You know," he said, "it's really not finished." Surprised, I extended my basket of crayons toward him. Taking a yellow crayon, he began to draw lines radiating from the crack in the vase to the very edges of the paper. Thick yellow lines. I watched, puzzled. He was smiling. Finally, he put his finger on the crack, looked at me, and said softly, "This is where the light comes through." Suffering is intimately connected to wholeness. The power in suffering to promote integrity is not only a Christian belief, it has been a part of almost every religious tradition. Yet 20 years of working with people with cancer in the setting of unimaginable loss and pain suggests that this may not be a teaching or a religious belief at all, but rather some sort of natural law. That is, we might learn it not by divine revelation, but simply through a careful and patient observation of the nature of the world. Suffering shapes the life force, sometimes into anger, sometimes into blame and self-pity. Eventually, it may show us the freedom of loving and serving life. What a powerful story. I think I might sound like a broken record, but I am finding these stories by Dr. Remen to be so powerful and so touching. And here she is again, really wowing me, and I hope really making this a moment of reflection for you as well. The premise of this story, or the kind of one of the main themes here, is anger. I think that is an emotion that many of us shy away from. Some of us might not even want to recognize that we have it. We might see it as somehow sinful to be angry, that shouldn't be a part of emotional vocabulary. But what Dr. Remen is teaching us is that anger is healthy. Sure, sometimes if it just sits as anger and stays with you, it can be corrosive to who you are. But it can be the seed to acting in ways that can bring about change and difference. And as she says, it can be an expression of a will to live, which is really amazing. So I think it's really interesting for us to first just think about how anger, our own personal anger, isn't necessarily an identity, but it can be a tool that we could use in our life. A couple of moments that I just wanted to pause and reflect on a little bit more was one, the first time that the individual, the patient, came to Dr. Remen's office and drew a picture of his body, of that just kind of vase with a big crack in it. So I'm wondering if you want to just take a moment. I know you don't have pen and paper in front of you, but how would you draw your own body? And now knowing this story, and knowing the end of this story, are there ways that you can draw your body and be a little bit more generous, a little bit more kind to who you are? Another piece of the story that was quite because a hinge moment where things really pivoted is when Dr. Remen asked the patient, is there something that you want to do about this anger? She had given the time for the individual to express their anger, to really become comfortable with it, but now is the time in her eyes, and in all of our moments, where we can use that anger and then use it as a fuel to do something. So I think that was a very telling moment, and so perhaps we can think about ways that, first ways to allow ourselves to express that anger in healthy ways, but then thinking about the next step, what can we do with that anger? And that eventually leads him to provide, to give back to those who've suffered kind of injuries like himself. And then she concludes with a really just a magical quote. Suffering is intimately connected to wholeness, or suffering is intimately connected with wholeness. Let me just get the exact quote here. Just a moment, sorry. There we are. Suffering is intimately connected to wholeness. Take a moment to think about that. It's not something intuitive that we would normally think about. We would say suffering is the opposite of wholeness. But she is teaching us, and I think the story is teaching us, and if I think we think about it and reflect on it a little bit more, that the moments of suffering in our lives can be intimately connected to wholeness. That it promotes integrity, and that it's a natural part of who we are. We will all suffer. We all do suffer, and it's what we do with that suffering, with that anger, that makes us a more whole person. I'm reminded by a quote from Leonard Cohen. Let me pull it up for us. It's from his song called Anthem. The birds, they sang at the break of day. Start again, I heard them say. Don't dwell on what has passed away, or what is yet to be. Yea, the wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So actually, I'm going to pull up a video of Leonard Cohen singing that song Anthem to conclude so that we can all enjoy that together as well. Okay. Thank you for joining me. Have a great day.